Hello everyone, in this video I'm going to be discussing speciation. You may be wondering, what is speciation? Well, it is one type of evolution in which organisms develop new traits. So speciation is a process in which new species emerge, and in order for me to explain speciation, I need to discuss gene flow. So gene flow is when organisms migrate between populations and they distribute alleles, and they also create variety in the genes between the alleles. So I'm going to simulate an example of speciation right now. So first I'm going to use these little marbles here to show them. So you can see we have a population here. You can see we have two populations here, and they're going through gene flow, mixing up alleles and such, and then suddenly a barrier becomes between them, and they cannot pass through to distribute more alleles. So genetic drift occurs between them. That is the random chance of variation in a group. It is similar to gene flow, but they are two separate topics. And then suddenly, the groups develop their own traits through reproductive isolation. Because they're isolated from each other, that means that they'll develop their own traits. And some of them may swap different traits. So then, once the barrier is removed, when you push them back together, we now have two separate species. A new species has emerged, basically. So that is what speciation is. So now let's talk about some of the types of speciation. So now I'm going to show you the three main types of speciation. So the first type is allopatric, and the next one is parapatric, and then the third one is sympatric. So the prefixes for them can give you a suggestion to what they actually are in terms of speciation. But now we're going to go through them, starting with allopatric. So this one is probably the simplest one in terms of understanding it. It is the exact one that I just went over when explaining what speciation is. We have a population where gene flow occurs. A barrier becomes between them. They cannot cross the barrier. And then the groups develop their own traits. The barrier is removed, and we have two separate species now. So allopatric is probably the simplest to understand. Next up, we have parapatric. Parapatric over here. And in this one, it's a little bit different, because in this one, there is still a sort of border, but they can go up to the edge and such. So there is reproductive isolation right along the borders, so they're adjacent to each other. In some cases, you'll have a sort of like hybrid zone in the middle of them, where you have a mix. Oh, red. And so in some cases, you'll have this hybrid zone in the middle. Try to think of this as almost like a Venn diagram of geographic areas. So we have like a mix in the middle and the different groups on either side. So parapatric is when they can go right up to the border between them, and they still develop different species. That occurs in all types of speciation. And then in sympatric speciation, this one, I'm going to need more marbles for this. This one is where we have a large group, and then suddenly the new species starts to develop right in the middle of the population. That's right there. And then this new species starts to grow as gene flow occurs, and also a little bit of genetic drift. And then suddenly you have 2 new populations. So all 3 of these have the same outcome. It's just the steps to get there are a bit different. So that is gene flow. But there is a little bit more to discover here, as there are other types of barriers besides just geographic. So I think it's best that I should go over those now. So you could see if you were making a sort of bubble map, this is what it would look like. There was speciation as the main topic here, and then allopatric, parapatric, and sympatric branch off of it because they're different types. Anyways, going back to the types of barriers, the first one is temporal. So temporal means time. Think of the T at the beginning of it. So that means when the different breeding populations happen at different seasons. So they never got a chance to mate because they happen at different time periods. And then the next type is behavioral. That means when populations have different sorts of behaviors. So think like trying to impress mates. So different types of birds might have different types of ways to impress mates. Like peacocks have their large tails with all the feathers. Other types of birds might appreciate a bigger beak or something like that. So that's behavioral. It has to do with the behavior of the organisms. Environmental. This one is this one has to do with where the organisms live. Try not to confuse this one with geographic. But environmental means like whether the animal lives in the sea versus if they live on a mountainside or on a plains or underground even. So where they live can impact how gene flow occurs between them, and that is a pretty big barrier. Next up, we have geographic. So geographic, a barrier would be if a sort of like natural structure or something came in between the populations, such as a glacier or a new river formed, separating the organisms on either side. Or if an earthquake happened and a chasm or a valley appeared. So geographic comes into being. Environmental is sort of already in place in terms of the barrier between organisms. And then the next barrier, the last one, is mechanical. So this one's a little bit more tricky to understand. This one actually has to do with how the breeding works between certain organisms. Like certain organisms just can't breed with other ones, and like certain flowers, the shapes of them can prevent crossbreeding between them. And the same thing goes with other types of organisms, just their size and structure just doesn't work in terms of breeding. So that's the last type of barrier. So we have these 5 here. These 5 don't always go with speciation, but they're just barriers in terms of reproduction in general. So it's important to know that. I would say geographic is the most common one in terms of speciation between creating new species in organisms. Anyways, I think that is everything for today. So thank you for watching this wonderful video about speciation.